If you could sort of state your name for the recording and if you're appearing on behalf of anybody, who that company or entity is. Thank
Errol,
you.
Lawson. Some of what I present will be via the Don't Frack Katherine group, and some of it's my own research work dating back a few years. I brought along 8 copies of my paper.
Yes, we all have. Thank you very much. Thank you for making that available.
I haven't burdened your staff with an electronic copy yet because I think I went through about 5 different versions of the first one, which caused some trouble. So I'll wait till this has gone over and I'll see what you say, and I'll probably amend it. I'll start to read the paper, and I'm sure I'll ad lib pretty soon.
Thank you. I might get the microphone just to come a little bit closer to you. If you just move it, yeah, just so I can, thank you. You've got a lovely soft voice. Thank you very much.
It's probably because I'm used to not used to microphones. I'm used to projecting.
It's for the recording.
We'll see how I go, and I'll start reading, and then we can...
Thank you very much.
I understand that the interim report is essentially a roundup of the evidence received by the panel during the first round of public hearings and community consultations. So I'm addressing the interim report. And that it follows the format of the issues paper, which is the starting point of the inquiry. I welcome the opportunity to respond to the interim report and propose to address my remarks to aspects which I believe are incomplete or missing. So it's not well done, it's beaut. It's well done, it's beaut, but there's stuff that I think has been left out for a number of reasons. I note the description of the report as interim, and with the exception of the preliminary assessment that the practice of injecting wastewater into aquifers should not occur, I understand that the judgment has not yet been written. That's your job, I think. My discussion falls under 2 headings: obviously, fracking and regulations. I include social licence in my discussion of regulations since my research strongly indicates that both are a precondition for success in any complex multidisciplinary project, which is extended both in time and space. Baselines are also inextricably linked to a successful regulatory regime. Is that voice coming out all right? Yep. Thanks. Fracking. The object of this section is to discuss incomplete treatment of the subject arising from the tendency to confine discussion of fracking to the act of fracturing the shale itself, or at least making the act of fracking the centre of presentations. This has been a phenomenon that we've experienced over the few years that we've tried to get on top of this job, that discussions were focused on the fracking, and when we tried to extend it beyond that, am I right to you? You hear me? Then we drew a blank. This has inhibited discussion of long-term effects and has contributed to a dialogue of the deaf, which those of us that are married probably understand. This limitation contributes to the failure to precisely define the elements of the process which are central to the analysis of risk and consequences of the development of an unconventional gas industry. It has also inhibited effective consideration of the long-term effects. The consequences of fracking encompass all social, economic and environmental changes both during as well as beyond the life cycle of any production field. Now that's my basic proposition, that if we're considering an unconventional gas industry, we have to look well beyond the immediate act of fracking and go way out into the future. My first introduction to fracking, to high volume, high pressure hydraulic fracturing of shale reservoirs, was a presentation by Santos in May 2014. And the first slide is taken from that presentation. It divides it's titled Pathway Development and identifies 5 stages leading to execution, which I take to mean production, and which estimated by Santos production to commence 8 to 10 years from the start of exploration and appraisal and lasting for 20 years. So I don't see any way that they could reasonably reduce that, and I think that some of your industry presentations suggested that slow and steady is a better way to go given the infrastructure weakness that we already have. My early interaction with the industry spokesman, as well as my individual readings in order to understand the implication of industry plans, were against this 5-stage model. And people who asked about well integrity and aquifer contamination into the future beyond production have not been given any answers of substance. The presentation centred on the diagram below, or some variation of it, as a simplified illustration of the equipment's configuration, comparing unconventional gas extraction in deep shale with horizontal wells, with conventional gas extraction, coal seam and tight gas. Now I'm sure you're all familiar with that beautiful vertical well, then the beautiful right angle bend, and the horizontal well, which is the focus of the conversation, except they seem to leave out perforation. With particular reference to questions on well integrity failure and associated probability of aquifer contamination, answers to how long will the cement last range from in perpetuity, and we really had someone from the industry say that twice, to decades, and I think I heard that in some of the presentations you got already. This failure or non-answer to achieve a constructive dialogue set the pattern, with proponents confining their representations up to the end of production and opponents attempting to extend the consideration of risks and consequences into the post-production era. Now, that's just a little beef I had about the difficulty of getting to a full picture of what the whole gas industry project would bring. I want to emphasise that throughout the ensuing years, along with those who are concerned about the long-term consequences of an unconventional gas industry, I tried to get answers from the industry on the longevity of the measures taken to ensure that no harm shall ensue subsequent to the departure of the gas industry. So if I can just emphasise that point, my experience has been consideration stopped when production stopped, and attempts to get conversations going on what happens after that didn't get very far. My attention focused on the cement barriers intended to isolate the fractured shale reservoir from the surface and intervene in geology. The particular concern is that failure of the cement barriers could allow migration of residual gas from the shale into the overlying aquifer into the atmosphere. And while there are concerns about other consequences throughout the life of the unconventional gas industry and beyond, the consequences of contaminated aquifer on the townships, communities, industry and the environment are well into the red zone of the risk consequences matrix. Now that's my judgment. As an aside, the panel would be aware that the Tyndall aquifer is currently being studied for the concentration and point spreading behaviour of contamination arising from the use of firefighting foams. And I just popped that in to say, look, we're not able to ignore the aquifer any longer. We've got experience right now of contaminated aquifer done quite unintentionally with the best of will, and now the army, the defence is playing catch up as hard as they can. So if there was ever an event that said, for goodness sake, be careful, that's one. I trust that, having expressed my deep concern at the long-term consequences of aquifers of an unconventional gas industry and my frustration at the apparent inability of the industry to pronounce on failure rates of abandoned wells into the future after the industry department, the panel understand my critical response to the inclusion in section 533 of the interim report of information from the APPA submission that, quote, for wells constructed to modern standards, this rate has been reported to be only 0.004% compared with 0.2% for older wells. I have to say that without qualification, the failure rate quoted, 4.004 repeated in the interim report, could be interpreted as being accepted by the inquiry as applying to well failure rate at any time in the life cycle and beyond. So, I'm sure I knew you'd say that. I thought long and hard about poking, but the point is other people look at that and say it's there, uncritically reported, and it has the authority of the panel of the inquiry rather than the whatever authority it deserves. 533. I have two guiding principles which generally keep me out of trouble. One of them is not to poke the judge too hard. The first is caveat emptor, which certainly applies to the unconventional gas proposition. The second is, if it looks too good to be true, it probably is. I applied both to the 004 figure, traced it back to its source. The following is an extract from the APPA submission. And there it is, a recent review by King & King, 2013, of the data from 253,090 wells in Texas found that only 4 out of every 100,000 wells constructed with modern standards experienced a loss of well integrity. This led me back to the 2000 review by King & King. I'll put the full title in because this guy loves his titles, and there's an essay alone in that. This is his title, Environmental Risk Arising from Well Construction Failure Differences Between Barrier and Well Failure and Estimates of Failure Frequency Across Common Well Types, Locations and Well Age, George King and Daniel King. And that title alone tells you a lot, because he's lumped in there the estimates that he's giving for common well types, common locations and common well age. And the King & King paper does include the figure of 004, don't question that, in Table 10 under the heading Well Integrity Failure Containment Lost. But also in the introduction, King & King says, environmental risk to groundwater from the integrity of producing wells is addressed in the study, Producing Wells, which also examines several other possibilities of environmental impact during the product producing lifespan. And here's the clincher. From the end of construction until plug-in and abandonment. So please take on board that if you're using figures, then locate them where they belong. Because you may know what you mean, but a lot of us out here would say, oh, that's got your credibility behind it. And again, King says, estimate accuracy depends on sufficient database of wells with documented failures divided into barrier failures in a multiple barrier system that did not create pollution and well integrity fails that created a leak path, whether or not pollution was created. Estimated failure frequency comparisons are valid only for a specific set of wells operating under the same conditions with similar design and construction quality. Well age and construction era are important variables. There is absolutely no universal definition of well failure frequency. So one of the reasons, I'm sure, is that when we asked industry what the failure rate was going to be well into the future, if they'd said quite honestly, we don't know, because we don't have any previous experience of shale wells used on shale beds of this age, 1,500 million years, which I think is about the oldest shale bed there is, made up of the early forms of organic life, not vegetable material. So we've got shales here that's quite different, and we've only got one sample that's only a few months old. So the point there is, nobody knows what the failure rate after plug-in and abandonment is. As the panel surely knows, there are figures flying all over the place. They are only useful and relevant if they refer to the particular stage of the life cycle for which they were derived. The King & King paper analyses data up to the end of production and does not prevent information on failure rates in subsequent stages of the life cycles of well. And that's where my concern is, because there's a lot of people who want to still live here and work and play after the gas people go home. That led me to another paper by George King. He's very prolific, and the industry seems to like him because a lot of their papers refer King & King. So I'm beautifully neutral. I'm not cherry picking, which we do when we want to, when we can. I think we get away with it. It's not likely. Hydraulic fracturing 101. Now listen to this list. What every representative, environmentalist, regulator, reporter, investor, university researcher, neighbour and engineer should know about estimating frac risk and improving frac performance in unconventional gas and oil wells. Now you know I read out the titles because it says it all. This paper provides the following definitions which are useful in defining what stage in the life cycle of a well a particular set of quoted statistics and risk consequences applies. Now this model made me realise why the Sandos model wasn't helping me very much, because this model has got the things divided into virtually engineering and operational phases. Barrier failure is multiple barrier system. In a multiple barrier system is a single failure of one of the sequence of casings and cements that are in place during construction of a well. As there are several barriers in the sequence, pollution or contamination neither escape from nor enter into a well. Well integrity failure. All barriers in the sequence fail in which fluids, oil and gas may move from inside to outside the well, contamination, pollution, or from outside to inside the well, intrusion of salt water. Drilling and completion, the phase taking the well to the point of handover to the production crew. In contractual terms, this marks, for me anyway, the delivery of a production-ready well to the supplier of construction by the supplier of construction services and acceptance as fit for purpose by the production operator. Do I need to explain that a bit? Back in my former life, I built electronic equipment for the Department of Defence, and so I was in the analogous position of drilling and completion. And I would finish the piece of kit, I would test it in private, and then I would say to the customer, who's in the analogy of the operator, come in, I will prove to you that it does what you want it to do, you take it away and operate it, and pay me. And the clincher is that there's a contractual interface there, which I can't find in the structure of the gas industry, and I don't know if you have, but this handover of responsibility, and that feeds then into who's responsible way into the future if something goes wrong, when something bad happens. And it's not enough for the regulator to say, I've signed off on you and your plug-in and abandonment, and away you go. There is evidence that something bad can happen, and so how do we get to the real liability? Plug-in and abandonment. The conclusion of the life cycle of the well, unless the regulator mandates further involvement, the gas company has no ongoing interest in the well. And I've actually seen that in writing from the minister in the last week, that he signs off and they go. There's another paper which I've just come across, and I left a copy of this one for you, called Energy Well Integrity, Nova Scotia Hydraulic Fracturing Review and Public Engagement Process. Now that title was so similar to what you folk are doing that I thought it's got to be helpful. It's a short title, but this time the list of panellists is huge. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13.
I know it's bigger than the inquiry.
Yeah, so therefore...
Anyway, the paper has sections, each of which addresses stages in the life cycle of a well. Section 6, well abandonment and long-term integrity, is particularly relevant to my concern that the risks and consequences after the regulator has released the gas company from further obligations are not addressed. The Nova Scotia review addresses this issue. In any case, most jurisdictions have orphan well funds provided by a levy on production that are used to fix wells for which an owner cannot be found. Otherwise, the responsibility is that the owner fix the leaking abandoned well to the standards set by the regulatory agency. So in Nova Scotia, they certainly have a mechanism which they call orphan well funds, and that recognises that owners cannot be found quite frequently, and but the government and the taxpayers are not left holding the baby. I'd make the point, which is also not addressed in the interim report and probably absent from submissions to date, that is that the risk management, risk mitigation step between risk identification and determination of consequences is not addressed. After risks are identified, you might, oh, right, okay. I'll just finish this off because this is the important one, the regulation one you can read. I make the point that after risks are identified and consequences, if nothing done is described as nothing done, there is a second round during which risk mitigation measures are developed and consequences after mitigation are described. So in a normal organisation, you do your first pass, risk, consequences, if nothing happens. and then you settle down those are the ones that you can leave alone. You must do something. You better bloody well do something, or you better find another way. And then you go into the second round and you work out that. So then you do your risk consequences matrix again. And management might even want you to do a third round, but they certainly would want you to keep under review. And so I suspect that's a little bit of an illumination of the simple risk matrix that you've applied. Consider the three major stages in the life cycle of a well: construction and completion, operations, abandonment. At each of these stages, there are different personnel involved. They have different objectives, different skill sets and equipment. I expect each would have their own risk management plans, but each would be different in detail. For example, the construction and completion stage is strong on engineering equipment. During operations, the engineers and their equipment are somewhere else, while after abandonment, everyone is somewhere else. So you've got different capabilities at each of those stages. And so that implies that should reflect into their risk management plans. It should also reflect into the resources they make available. The time lapse from occurrence of an event, the manifestation of a risk, to availability on the scene of people and equipment to prevent unwanted consequences will vary depending on the stage of the cycle. I conclude this section with the following request: recognise that the risk and consequences of an unconventional gas industry extend beyond the plugging and abandonment of wells. In analysing information on failure weights, determine at what stages in the life cycle of a well the information refers, and that also means the wells and their age. In view of the caveat in the summary of the 2013 King and King paper, note that there are no valid figures presently available for failure rates of unconventional wells in the Northern Territory. So we don't know. And I think I'll jump a little bit because I get onto something what's important. Close plugging and abandonment. DPR's advised that at the conclusion of a project, the operator must demonstrate that rehabilitation of the site has been carried out in order to receive the environmental rehabilitation security bond, leaves the government exposed to high risk of having to fund harm that may take decades to manifest itself. The Nova Scotia Review Well Integrity states that most jurisdictions have orphaned well plans. The problem associated with loss of well integrity of abandoned wells is monitoring. And there's a mention of that in the Nova Scotia paper. What physical properties are monitored? How long and for how long? Who is responsible? How labour intensive? What to monitor? Probably the presence of methane at the surface or in groundwater, pressure in abandoned casings. How long, for how often? Only experience will tell. Start off conservatively. Who is responsible? Has to be the regulator, funded from a production levy. Labour intensive, and I suspect this is a big argument. SCADA, modern SCADA, that's surveillance, communications and data acquisition equipment, could easily accommodate the monitoring of several wells, especially multi-pad wells, multi-well pads, reporting on a routine basis, or by exception with a parameter exceeding the predetermined limit. Should I stop there?
You've got another, probably 3 minutes.
Okay. I have, along with everybody else that I talk to, a deep concern that one of the biggest risks is the regulator, the difficulty the regulator has. I contend that a regulator regime is much more than a document. It includes the inspectors and the resources which enable them to do their job. A regulator regime becomes a robust regulator regime when the overseers are experienced and knowledgeable in the industry and are in sufficient numbers. Above all, the regulator regime can be undermined once the industry learns that upper management, including the political class, is willing to intervene. Now then I've got a discussion from my own experience which draws on some Japanese writings, that 80% of an organisation's knowledge on how to conduct its operations is tacit knowledge, which is located in the shared experience of the participants and the evolved agreements on how things are done. The habitus of peer bourdieu. These experiences do not map onto the organisation chart, cannot be captured on a project flow chart, on a decision tree, or on a list of processes. They exist in a structure of networks of interpersonal relationships which parallel a formal structure and take time to form. They provide the vehicle where novel problems are solved. In Bourdieu's model of social structure, these multiple networks constitute the social capital, and as I stated in my input on social license, they're the source of social license. Both documented regulations and formal network-based structures are necessary preconditions for any enterprise to succeed. Second aspect of management of a complex enterprise is highlighted by the capability maturity model. Now, I tried this on Alan Hawke and it didn't get anywhere, but I'll pop it here because it demonstrates the disparity that I suspect exists between government regulators and the industry. Capability maturity model shows up strengths and weaknesses, examines 3-level process areas, defines 5 levels of capability ranging from level 1 performed informally to level 5 continuously improving. Defence mandated level 3 well defined. It's difficult to rate industry in Northern Territory government any higher than 1 performed informally. Now that diagram there shows that improvement path. I'm pretty sure that the industry, in terms of their engineering projects and organisation, would claim level 3, possibly level 4. I suspect that if the regulator, with the regulations that are currently in existence, as Tina Hunter said, still needs improvement. If they're at level 1, they've still got a long way to go. So the disparity between the 2 levels is probably too great, and so the highest risk, I would say, is that or up there in the top right-hand corner, is this disparity between the regulator and the regulated. And how we define that risk, I don't know. I've seen the term regulator capture, but I think I've also seen in America at one stage regulator dominance. And the gap, the disparity was too great. I should stop there. I got a bit about water disposal, but I was pleased to hear Mr. Crowhurst say that they're thinking of a water treatment plant. There would still be the scaling up problem of traffic, but not nearly as much as going from here to Queensland, but it would be centralised. That's enough for me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lawson, and thank you again, as ever, for your detailed and thorough presentations, which the panel always looks forward to.
I must confess it was just finished this morning.
Doesn't matter, as long as it's finished, and particularly because you've given us references, which is very, very helpful. I suppose it's really more of a comment than anything else, and forgive me if it sounds a bit defensive, but we do know that we have more work to do on well integrity, both at the start, basically, the drilling and the fracking, and at the end, the decommissioning as well. And you're quite right, the figures vary wildly. I mean, I think as you've quite properly pointed, you can compare, for example, APIA's figures in their submissions versus, say, Queensland Gas Fields Commission's reporting up to 9%. Sorry, that was WA, I should say. WA, Department of Mines and Petroleum, found that 9% had production tubing failures, for example, and 3% had production casing failures. So, in SA, again, the figures vary as well. So they do swing wildly about the place, and we are having a bit of difficulty sort of pinning that down. And of course, that depends in part on what is a well failure. Is that a complete failure that results in aquifer contamination or some other form of fugitive emission, or is that just one of the casings happens to crack? It varies.
It's just a barrier failure.
Yeah, that's right. So it does vary, and as I said, we are aware that we need to do a lot more work on that between now and the end of the year.
Having decided that we don't know, and we can't know until we do something, and so the precautionary principle is really, really important. So what do you do? What I've done in my former life, I just started monitoring everything I could possibly think of, because then they're really in an experiment. It's a scientific experiment at that stage.
Yep.
And I suppose one way of encouraging that, very strongly encouraging that to occur, is which the panel's giving consideration to. It hasn't formed a fixed opinion on this, is to reverse the onus of proof. so that if there is a problem, then it's up to the operators to prove there isn't a problem. That has the advantage, very strong advantage, of making sure that they do those baseline monitoring, the baseline test and data obtaining and do the monitoring as well.
Yes, we skipped the paragraph on baselining, which I think is it's just so fundamental, and I cannot believe that Hawke recommended, get on with it, that the regulator or the government has allowed the industry to present its baselining as adequate. And I mean, you would know more than I would, but if an industry fronts up for litigation with a complainant like me that says my bore is messed up, and you say to them, what's the baseline? Would you accept one of the defendant's evidence of an independent, plausible, credible baseline? I suspect not. So baselining has to be independent and certifiable. Otherwise, folk like you would say there's nothing to argue about. There's no grounds. And I think that's already happened in Queensland. So, I mean, that was me telling you your job, which is still cheeky, but I'll do that.
Thank you. Yes. Any questions for Dr. Lawson? Sure. Yes, Professor Hart.
I thought you were a bit tough in your opening remarks, suggesting that we'd only focused on the fracking process.
Oh no, it wasn't. I'm sorry, it wasn't you. It was the you. That's.
On your first page.
Yeah, I know. I tried to describe the interim report as a roundup of all your evidence, and then I went on to say, in our dealings with the industry, they draw us back always to fracking, to blowing holes in rocks and getting gas out.
Sure, because that's our terms of reference, is to go broadly,
yes,
social, environmental, and so right. We'll let that one go. On you as you said, skipped over the baseline, and we think that's extremely important. I was just going to suggest that your suggestion there, you focused on baseline as a foundation for litigation. Yep. Totally agree with that. But I think that sort of undervalues the other very important component of baseline information, and that's actually planning. Planning what they do, what government does, whether they let it go, etc., etc. So I'd just expand. I think the panel is certainly seeing baseline requirements as being vital. On your regulatory regime comments, we've had a number of people who have said pretty much the same as you, can't trust the government, etc., etc. And so a number have been bringing up the concept of an independent regulator. You've obviously thought seriously about that. Could you just roll out what does an independent regulator in the NT for an onshore gas industry, what's it look like?
I come at it from another direction.
Yep, sure.
I lived my life in the public service, and there were many levels. And if you bring an independent regulator in, the buck still stops up at the government. And so all you've done is put another interface in, another awkward transition, and immediately then you can, just like the regulations themselves, you can write the terms of reference, you can write the rules of engagement, but unless you can get good people that are knowledgeable in industry, that have that tacit knowledge, and this is why I kind of, the Japanese stuff is important. And I've seen that happening. I worked in a very stable organisation with those networks. We called it the Old Boy Network. And if we saw a problem, we just ring around and say, who the hell knows about this? And I tried that on when I was lecturing to industry, defence industry. I said the same thing. And these companies were very hidebound because they were infected with managerialism. And I'd say to these practising engineers, what happens when you get a problem when you can't solve it? And without exception, ring a mate. And this is the wicked problems, the ones that are outside the things. And these are the ones that bring you down. And so if it happens again, then you put it in the regulations, but they never happen again. And so, I'm a fan of networks, and I could talk for a while on them, but networks will form. People will form networks, and people belong to multiple networks, and they will talk to each other. And if management ignores them and resists them, then you've got a subversive organisation. If management, and the one I was in, management was all part of the networks, and so we could work at our level, solve the problem, and then tell the bosses, and that was ideal. Now, any agency you put in place, if it doesn't have that capability, if it's only got a book of rules, then it's only going to be addressing 20% of what's going on, and they'll be blindsided.
Look, I appreciate that. I think that's good. But the networking, the internal solving of problems is great. But that doesn't say much for the community in terms of transparency. How do you convince the community that this independent body, your set of mates, is actually doing a good job?
Well, that's where the social licence comes in.
Okay.
Because when you've got multiple networks, and this is the amazing thing. There's a mob in University of Melbourne that studied multiple networks extensively, and so we're in a church, we're in a profession, our kids go to a school, we meet in the shopping centre, we play a sport, and so up here there's my professional network. But if I used to go to church with a bloke in one of the other divisions, and I could buttonhole him after church and say he was the son of the captain of HMS Australia, so he'd never had a father that he knew, which is, you know these things, and you behave respectfully. But I could get to him any time I liked, and that's the way they work. Now, if they're known and they're visible, then the community accepts what they do. If they're not, if they're closed,
sure.
if they're a kind of an oligarchical clique,
Thanks.
like the New
That's
South
good.
Wales government.
Yes, Dr. Beck, but mindful of time.
You have clearly articulated some issues, and the reference to the Nova Scotia one is particularly relevant, and we've recently had some other references given to some other papers as well too, so thank you very much for that. I just want to come back to your sort of perhaps the linking with the defence industry, because you've outlined here on the final page sort of a process capability aspect. I really just want to explore with you how, on one hand, applicable that is to the gas industry, and I think we also have to admit that we only know too well from the defence industry that there have been some monumental failures in terms of delivery. So the defence industry has got its problems as well too. So and there are many of them, and they're still trying to grapple with them. So given that we know we've got some issues in the oil gas industry, given that we know the defence industry has its problems, what is your sort of pathway for the golden age?
Thanks for that, because I hoped you asked me what was the currency of this, because I think it felt like a lead balloon in defence. It was just too difficult, and in fact, there were no career opportunities in pushing that. Managerialism taken over well and truly, and one very brave engineer gave a talk at a conference where he analysed. He was for inside defence procurement, and he analysed his own agency and came out at level 1, which was a very career move, because he was never heard of again. So I put this in mainly to say, look, here's a quick look at there have been attempts made that you can you feel there's something going wrong. And if you look at this and you say, well, if they're just at level 1, performed informally, and they're dealing with people at level 3, then they're gonna miss. But this doesn't work, and I don't have an answer. I really don't, except to slow things down. When in doubt, go slow. And this one has got so many doubts. You know, the Beetaloo Sub-Basin particularly, which has got such a head of steam of enthusiasm. And I said to one of the industry men at the Katherine show, does someone tell Canberra or Frydenberg that it's not a case of sticking a straw in the Beetaloo Sub-Basin and that'll solve the East Coast gas prices before Christmas? And he nodded. I mean, they know what their timescale is. They know that 8 to 10 years. Origin themselves said if we go recognising the limits of the number of wells we have, then we'll be fracking continuously and producing continuously. There won't be a fracking, construct and complete phase, and then those wells, those people will go. So, to weaken my own case, if we're in production and something happens that requires the construction and completion people and their equipment, then they're not that far away, as long as the roads aren't wet. So it's whichever way you look at it, it says to me, there are so many unknowns, and you just beg for time, and that's the only conclusion I come to. I mean, I went through a process of saying, well, what would my mechanical engineer friends do? And I think of the Barra Sonobuoy, and that was a sonobuoy that was released out of an aeroplane in a canister about that big, that diameter, and it folded out 5 expanding arms. That expanding mechanism and the packaging of that was just a brilliant piece of mechanical engineering. It took them years to perfect that. It took them building a facility down in the southeast of South Australia where they could get down into one of the very, very clear ponds in the limestone things, and they just fired these things until they worked. And that was a massive experiment. And I thought, well, how would I do that with a gas well? You know, I thought, how could I do an experiment? Could I pick an area that's got shale, that's representative, but there's no aquifers, so I don't do any harm? Then what would I do? And it's not the nature of the beast. They are, in fact, an industry that's used to crashing on, and their whole history of process improvement, which is very admirable, says to me that they encounter the event and then they react to it. And when you've got an environment like this where the aquifers are so important to the existing society and communities and the industries, and the industries that want to be organic suppliers of food, then it really is festinate lente. And I was going to say, do I have to translate my Latin?
No, that's fine. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
We will have to leave it there. Dr. Lawson, I can see our next presenter waiting very patiently. Thank you very much again for your detailed presentation. It's very much appreciated. Thank you.